Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI was laid to rest in the Vatican today after his death Saturday at age 95. His successor, Pope Francis, presided over the funeral, one of the very few times in history that one pope has done so for another. That's because after leading the Catholic Church for 8 years, Benedict resigned in 2013, the first pope to give up power in 6 centuries. His death closes the book on a complicated chapter within the Catholic Church, as Benedict's tenure was punctuated by accusations that he mishandled allegations of sexual abuse by members of the clergy. So what kind of legacy does the late Pope leave behind? And what's next for the future of the Catholic Church? I'm joined by Thomas Groome, a professor of theology and religious education at Boston College, who is also the author of What Makes Education Catholic? Spiritual Foundations, and Margaret Roylance, Vice President of Voice of the Faithful, a lay Catholic group that supports survivors of clergy sex abuse and promotes change within the Church. Thank you both for joining me. Let's start, if you would, Thomas, with the funeral itself. I think people are fascinated by the tradition and by the ritual around a papal funeral. Can you explain, just very basically, one of the details? The Pope is buried in 3 coffins. This is a coffin inside a coffin inside a coffin. Is there anything you can tell us about why that is, or the meaning of why he is buried with certain elements?
Liz, you just taught me something. I didn't know he was buried in 3 coffins, but he certainly will have enough coffins. I suppose it's for security, and I think this event captures the imagination of the world because it's almost 2,000 years, and that this goes back. Now, I don't think St. Peter had that elaborate an inauguration, but very soon in the early centuries of the Church, the Church began to take on these powerful trappings, and in some ways it was a reflection of the Roman Empire, and the emperor was at the top, and then all the legates down around him, etc. And but so the papacy, I suppose it engages people's imagination. There's very little going on in our world that goes back a couple of thousand years. Or they can be traced 1,500 years at least, shall we say. So in that sense, it's fascinating. The 3 coffins are probably, as I said, just a security, because there was probably at times in the history of the Church when people would come and try to take the body as relics or something, and so I'm not sure why they did, why the 3 coffins. Like I've never heard of it before.
Okay, well, we can leave it.
He's certainly well buried.
I would think so. Thomas, what do you think the legacy will be of Pope Benedict for the Church?
Yeah, well, like all of us, Liz, he left a mixed legacy, really. I mean, there are ways in which your introduction was mentioning the sex abuse scandal, and there are ways in which he did better than Pope John Paul II did. On the other hand, there are ways in which he didn't live up to our expectations either. And but it was a growing consciousness for the Church throughout its history, or throughout that time and that era, that this was not just a sin, but this a horrible crime and destructive of children, etc., or of victims or whatever age. So the Church was sadly slow to realize and recognize that and to act accordingly. But he did, I think, in fairness to him, he did take us a step beyond where Pope John Paul II had it. John Paul basically left it in the hands of the local bishops. And the local bishops basically were negligent. Very often, the people accused of the crime were buddies of the bishop. There were priests in the same diocese together. So a lot of dioceses were doing nothing about it. And Benedict took it out of the hands of the local bishops into the hands of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. In other words, took the whole thing to the Vatican. And after that, there was a lot more priests suspended and expelled, etc., etc. So in a sense, he was somewhat of a catalyst toward addressing the issue.
So let's bring in Margaret on that. Certainly, you have a take on this. How do you view his legacies through the lens of the sexual abuse?
Well, as everybody has said, Tom included, he was a complex man, and he did many things well. His he was a theologian, and a lot of his ideas informed the concepts of Vatican II. So he was always saw people had accused him of being he was all about continuity, but no, he, as well as every pope since John the 23rd, has recognized that there needed to be reform in the church. But as I have said before, he was a real creature of the church of the 20th century. And he had all the blind spots that go with that, including protecting the church at all costs, a real aversion to transparency. And he was, I believe, that his main strength was that he could see, he really recognized the harm and the tragedy of the sexual abuse crisis and did something about it. He was the one that got rid of Martial Maciel and a lot of others. So he cleaned up a lot of the mess that he inherited from John.
Right. And Margaret, you seem to suggest that the abuse, the problem, the scale of it, that was the cause of his resignation.
No, I don't think that was, I mean, certainly that was part of it. He resigned, I think, as an act of real courage because he looked at the problems and said, I cannot solve them. It's beyond me. It's a problem bigger than I am. And so he had the courage to resign. And once he was no longer Bishop of Rome, he was no longer the Pope. And he, to a large extent, stepped back and let Francis try to carry on with reform. And I believe that as far as abuse is concerned, I think Francis has done many good things.
On the point of the resignation, though, Thomas, do you see that as really part of why he stepped down?
I think so. I think I would agree with Margaret that I think he was tired and he recognized that he didn't have the energy, the courage, whatever it was he was lacking. He was tired. And I think in some ways, it'll be his great lasting legacy. Now, that's not to minimize the other good things he did. But 500 years from now, when they talk about Benedict, the one thing they'll say about him is that he resigned. And in a sense, he helped to demystify the role of the papacy. Like Catholics, we think of the papacy, of the Pope, as almost like a divine being that ontologically is different from the rest of us. And in a sense, Benedict simply said, no, it's a function of service. It's a ministry to the church, and it's a role of service. And he was tired and weary of serving for 8 years, and so he happily resigned. And I think he really did resign. There was a lot of fear at the time. Would he really? Would we end up with two popes in conflict? Because he was distinctly more right of center than than Pope Francis. And so there was a lot of apprehension. Would the kind of more traditionalist Catholics still have a hero in Benedict, and the reformist people would be more attached to Pope Francis? But that did not transpire, really. In fairness to him, he kept quiet and kept to himself, said his prayers, and got himself ready to go home to God.
But with his passing, we again seem to be hearing a lot of talk about how the church is at a crossroads, how Benedict was very much and is sort of an avatar for conservatism, and Francis instilled with the more progressive qualities. Thomas, do you think these distinctions are valid?
Well, I think some of the distinctions are valid, and some of the ways in which he was a traditionalist didn't bother me too much. The fact that he allowed some people to go back to celebrating the Mass in Latin, I thought that was a little bit crazy, but a lot of people seemed to want it, or at least a very small minority of people. So I wasn't too troubled by that at all, and none of my friends who were and who thought it was awful that he did that, etc. But I thought that'll die out. But some of the things that the traditionalist positions he took that were destructive, for example, example, towards our gay, our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, he was very insensitive and basically reiterated and used language and allowed the church to use language like it being intrinsically disordered and a grave depravity. Very different than Pope Francis. Pope Francis said we've got to listen and learn. We've got to listen to and learn from our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. And the church is in a transition in this regard. And it has to be, because in many ways our position on the whole issue of sexual orientation is false. It's based on false science, false biology, false sociology, false psychology. So we're all learning to stand back and say, just condemning gay people that way is totally false. And we can't do that. And as Francis says, we've got to listen and learn. And we've faced into a new moment because, the church approved of slavery for 1900 years. So that the fact that they have opposed LGBTQ people and gay lifestyle is not surprising, but it should not be our future. Benedict did nothing to move us ahead. In fact, he reiterated the traditionalist position.
So, Margaret, how do you see this idea of a crossroads? Do you see the passing of Benedict as removing some sort of break on those critics of Pope Francis, that the divisions will rise?
Well, I don't think so. I think that Pope Francis has a view of the church that really is, I think, characterized by the conclusion at this point so far of the synod, which is broaden your tent, listen, and I think that he's very much moving forward with a new paradigm of the church that involves mutual discernment, including the clergy and the people of God. Well, they're included in the people of God, but I think that Benedict couldn't see that, was not comfortable with that. And a lot of how shall I say this, the plutocrats, the rich American Catholics that are funding the bishops that are opposing Francis have been, referring to Benedict improperly to some extent, and I think that they're going to lose some steam because of this.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thomas Groome, Margaret Roylance, thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.